CNN.
Radio.
Last week started out with a message of reassurance from President Obama during a speech in Minnesota on controlling gun violence.
There's no legislation to eliminate all guns. There's no legislation being proposed to subvert the Second Amendment.
But those words didn't do much to quell the wave of unrest passing through states that staunchly support gun rights.
How many of you would agree we'd all be better off with a little less federal government in our lives? How many of you would agree we'd all be better off with a lot less federal government in our lives?
In Atlanta, pro-gun demonstrators gather in front of the state capitol. Long guns can legally be carried on the streets of Georgia, so many of the attendees have semi-automatic weapons slung over their shoulders. They're here to speak out against federal gun control measures of any kind. But the 10th Amendment is being cited as much as the second here.
Our rights and our Constitution was developed to keep states their individual power.
That's Ross Jackson, and he's one of the growing crowd of Americans who are calling themselves tenthers. Americans who believe that state governments should be able to pass legislation that opposes federal laws.
My governor in my state knows more about what's going on in my state than somebody that's in Washington, D.C. that's not here.
State lawmakers in the South are listening.
This bill would provide that any federal law attempting to ban semi-automatic firearms or to limit the size of a magazine of a firearm or any other limitation on firearms in this state shall be unenforceable.
That's Alabama Republican State Senator Shadrick McGill, and he's reading the bill he introduced on the first day of Alabama's state session last week. It's similar to bills being debated in Texas, Mississippi, Missouri, Tennessee, and Wyoming. Bills that would block federal enforcement of any gun restrictions in those states. But McGill's bill goes further than most. It would make it a felony for anyone to enforce those federal laws in Alabama. McGill says the bill is not just a message to Washington.
I believe the environment is such and that the constituents of the state of Alabama have spoken loud and clear and that their desire is that we would pass pro-gun legislation in the state this year.
Even before the tide-shifting shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary, 8 states had laws on their books that, in theory, exempt them from federal gun control measures. But Kermit Roosevelt, a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania specializing in constitutional conflicts, says it doesn't matter.
These are basically a resolution of disapproval. A state legislature could enact a resolution saying, we don't like this federal law. We wish it didn't exist. We wish we didn't have to follow it. But all the same, they do have to follow it. This is probably more political grandstanding than complete ignorance about the relation of the states and federal government.
Even so, while many of the states in the Northeast move to tighten restrictions, many of the states across the South are loosening laws.
It's time for us as politicians to get our collective noses out of the religious affairs of churches and to allow the churches themselves to make their own theological decisions.
That's State Representative Nate Bell of Arkansas, and he's talking about a bill to allow guns in churches in his state. That bill has sailed through both the House and Senate and has now been signed into law by Arkansas Governor Mike Beebe. Pastor Marie O'Connell says she doesn't necessarily support more guns in her church, First Presbyterian of Little Rock, but she does support the right for churches to make up their own minds on the issue.
Even though I personally don't feel that guns are going to help spread the gospel message, I can understand other churches might feel differently, and I have to respect that.
And that same debate is happening in schools. Lawmakers in Tennessee, Colorado, and Georgia have introduced bills to allow school employees to carry weapons. And in Mississippi, those firearms could be concealed. Here's what Mississippi House Education Chairman John Moore told Mississippi Public Radio there.
It allows a local school district to set up their own marshal service, if you will, and just to have a secret force within that school that's armed.
The push for tighter restrictions in the Northeast and looser restrictions, or a block of any gun control measures in the Southeast and West, shows the country is still bitterly divided, mostly along party lines on this issue. In fact, that division is historic. More states are controlled by one party now than at any other time in 6 decades in American politics. There are 13 democratically controlled states and 24 controlled by Republicans, which means bills like one in Tennessee to allow ammunition to be kept in cars as long as they're locked are much more likely to pass than any sweeping federal changes. Tommy Andres, CNN.